Imagine cleaning up after alien diplomats for over a decade. Your war medals hidden under a bed while they treat you like furniture. That's Marcus Rodriguez's life on Harmony Station, until the Zephyrian delegation arrives with their servant race mentality. They're about to learn why you should never underestimate the janitor with 17 military decorations. You know how some people just blur into the background of a busy place? Their uniforms become wallpaper and their faces might as well be name tags that say staff? That's Marcus Rodriguez. 12 years mopping floors and scrubbing bio-residue off the observation deck viewports. 12 years of cleaning up after diplomats, traders, and 6 different species whose idea of a mess ranges from glitter-like pollen to acid-seeping moss. His days follow a rhythm so precise you could set a chronometer by it. First, the nutrient spill in the canteen from the Glimmer folk, whose idea of breakfast involves a lot of shimmering, edible dust. Then the gelatinous puddles left by the aquatic delegates near the hydration chambers. By midday, he's polishing the handrails in the command wing, where important people in crisp uniforms talk about things like trade routes and ceasefires, without ever appearing to notice the man wiping their fingerprints away. And he doesn't mind, really. Psychology studies sometimes talk about institutional invisibility, how, in highly structured environments, service staff can become part of the cognitive scenery, noticed only when something is out of place. For Marcus, that's not a bug, it's the point. Between swipes of the mop, he has conversations with his equipment. "All right, Steve," he'll mutter to the mop handle. "Looks like the Threllians had another heated discussion in conference room 4. Bioplasmic residue. They really need to work on keeping their emotions in check." It's a dry, running commentary that keeps the silence and the memories at a comfortable distance. After 12 years of active service, a lot of veterans seek out jobs with structure, clear tasks, and low stakes. No life or death decisions, no command structure, no one shooting at you. Just a checklist, a mop bucket, and the satisfying swipe of a clean floor. For Marcus, janitorial work was the perfect cover, a way to disappear on purpose. So when a new ship decloaks at the edge of Harmony Station's docking array, shiny and sleek and radiating superiority, Marcus just notes the new scuff marks it'll probably leave on the deck plating. He doesn't look up. He just keeps mopping. Then the Zephyrians arrived. Their ship slid into the docking bay without a sound, a needle of polished dark metal that seemed to swallow rather than reflect light. No scorch marks from thrusters, no clumsy clamps locking into place, just a seamless, almost predatory arrival that suggested they didn't need to ask permission to be there. Their whole ship looked less like a vessel and more like a statement. The delegation moved with the same unnerving quiet. Tall, slender figures covered in iridescent feather-like scales that shifted color as they walked, absorbing the station's artificial luminance. Their limbs were long and precise, joints bending with an efficiency that made human movement look clumsy. You could tell their posture wasn't just physical, it was social. Their heads tilted upward slightly, chins raised, eyes scanning rooms as if taking inventory. And when those eyes passed over the human staff, they didn't linger. It wasn't rudeness, exactly. More like how you might glance at a chair or a terminal, useful but not worth noticing. Ambassador Claxon led them, his feathers a deeper shade of metallic blue than the others. He didn't walk so much as glide, each step measured and silent. He spoke to Station Director Hayes without really looking at him, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to fill spaces without effort. It's a classic power play in interstellar diplomacy, the delegation that treats the host facility as an extension of their own territory. The subtle assertion that they're here is a courtesy, not a negotiation. You could feel the atmosphere on Harmony Station tighten. The usual low hum of conversation in the corridors dropped. Technicians paused their work. Even the other alien species seemed to move with more care, giving the Zephyrians a wider berth. First contact specialists note this kind of thing. The way a dominant culture's certainty can press down on a mixed environment, creating pockets of tension you could almost taste. It wasn't just the silence, though. It was the way Claxon's entourage would reposition objects they touched. A datapad left a few centimeters to the left, a chair angled differently. Tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments, as though improving something that had been poorly arranged. The message was clear: we know better. Your standards are not ours. And then came the moment the mask slipped. It happened near the central atrium. A young human comms officer, rushing to deliver a message, accidentally crossed too close to Claxon's path. The ambassador didn't step aside. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply continued moving, forcing her to stumble back, and one of his guards placed a firm, unyielding hand on her shoulder to steer her further from their leader's trajectory. No words, no offense taken. Just a quiet, effortless demonstration of hierarchy. So when Ambassador Claxon finally settled into negotiations with Director Hayes, the tone was already set. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made demands. But everyone on the station understood exactly how the Zephyrians viewed humanity. Useful, perhaps, but ultimately invisible. And that quiet arrogance was about to turn into something much louder. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. Ambassador Claxon sat across from Station Director Hayes in the polished chrome conference room, the air smelling faintly of ozone and ambition. They were supposed to be discussing trade routes, mineral rights, docking privileges, the usual dance of interstellar diplomacy where both sides pretend they're equals until the music stops. Claxon's feathers shimmered under the lights, each one seeming to absorb the room's tension and reflect back pure, undisturbed superiority. Director Hayes kept his voice calm, his hands flat on the table, trying to steer the conversation toward mutual benefit. But Claxon wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to inform. He cut through the pleasantries like a scalpel. "Your species shows admirable diligence in maintenance and support roles," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that didn't ask for permission to be heard. "It is why the Zephyrian expansion considers humanity ideal for structured service. We do not see this as a negotiation. We see it as an allocation." The humans in the room, aides, techs, Hayes himself, went still. You could feel the temperature drop. Linguistics experts would call this declarative framing, using language not to propose but to define reality, to shape perception through sheer certainty. When someone tells you what you are, especially in a tone that brooks no argument, it isn't just communication, it's colonization. Director Hayes tried to smile. It looked like it hurt. "Ambassador, I think there may be some cultural misunderstanding. Humanity values partnership, collaboration." His words were smooth, practiced, the kind of diplomatic padding meant to absorb shocks without cracking. But you can't cushion a bullet with a blanket. Claxon tilted his head, a gesture that wasn't curious. It was condescending. "There is no misunderstanding. Your people are orderly. You follow instructions. You maintain systems you did not build. These are the traits of a servant race. We are not offering you a role. We are recognizing it." In that moment, diplomacy hit its limits. You can't bargain with bigotry. You can't compromise with contempt. All you can do is sit there while your entire species gets downgraded from potential partners to permanent staff. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was thick, heavy. The human aides stopped typing. Their eyes flicked from Hayes to Claxon and back, waiting for a response that wouldn't come. You could see the anger start, not in shouts or protests, but in the tightness around Hayes's mouth, the way one of the junior diplomats balled her hand under the table. It was the kind of fury that doesn't explode. It simmers. It calculates. And somewhere on the station, a man with a mop was probably wiping down a rail, completely unaware that his entire species had just been reassigned. Ambassador Claxon didn't wait for a reply. He stood, his movements efficient and fluid. "Your compliance will be noted. My staff will provide the new protocols." And just like that, it was over. The meeting adjourned. The declaration made. Humanity had been filed away under useful subordinates, and the Zephyrians moved on as if they'd just commented on the weather. But when someone tries to put you in a box, they rarely check what's already inside it. And as Claxon left the room, he had no idea that his new policy was about to collide with a very old, very different kind of order. One that didn't involve trade agreements. One that involved metals. The excuse was security. The intent was humiliation. Commander Vex, head of Zephyrian security, made the announcement over the station's comm system. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth or apology. Routine inspections, he called them, necessary for the safety of all species aboard Harmony Station. But everyone knew what they really were. A show of force. A reminder. You live here because we allow it. Your space is not your own. His teams moved through the human quarters with a cold surgical precision. They weren't looking for weapons or contraband. They were conducting an audit of dignity. They opened footlockers and dumped the contents onto the floor. They ran scanners over family photos, their devices' low hum seeming to dismiss the sentimental value. One guard picked up a hand-knitted sweater from a young engineer's bunk, holding it between two fingers like a soiled rag before letting it drop. It's a classic tactic of control, using the pretense of safety to dismantle personal boundaries, to make a people feel exposed and powerless in their most private moments. The message was clear: you have nothing we need to respect. The moment that truly revealed the chasm, though, happened in a narrow corridor outside the living quarters. A female technician, her hand still smudged with grease from maintaining the environmental systems, tried to step in front of Commander Vex. "Sir, that image frame, it's my children, on their first day of school. It's the only copy I have." Her voice was tight, a mix of anger and a plea for basic decency. Vex didn't even look at her. He glanced at the small digital frame in his subordinate's hand, then back at the woman. Sentimental artifacts are a security risk. They can be used to encode data, or trigger emotional responses that compromise judgment. He said it like he was reading from a manual. The dismissal of familial bonds isn't just an insult. It's a fundamental rejection of a core human motivation. Across cultures, family represents identity, continuity, a reason to endure. To treat it as a weakness or a flaw is to misunderstand humanity on a primal level. The technician just stood there, her face pale as the Zephyrian moved past her. The teams continued their methodical sweep, room by room. They left a trail of quiet fury in their wake, a resentment that began to simmer through the human sections of the station. They were getting closer to the maintenance wing, to the smaller, more Spartan quarters reserved for the support staff. Commander Vex's expression never changed. This was a procedure, a box to check. He had no reason to expect anything interesting, just more uniforms, more personal effects, more proof of the simple, orderly servants they believed humans to be. They reached a door marked with a simple alphanumeric code. Inside was a room barely larger than a storage closet. Neat, Spartan, exactly what you'd expect. And under a narrow cot, pushed toward the wall, was a sealed metal container. It was heavy, it was locked, and it didn't belong with the mops and the cleaning solvents. This is why they started the searches, to demonstrate that nothing of the humans was beyond their reach. They just had no idea what they were about to grasp. You know how some people just blur into the background of a busy place? Their uniforms become wallpaper and their faces might as well be name tags that say staff. That's Marcus Rodriguez, 12 years mopping floors and scrubbing bioresidue off the observation deck viewports. 12 years of cleaning up after diplomats, traders, and 6 different species whose idea of a mess ranges from glitter-like pollen to acid-seeping moss. His days follow a rhythm so precise you could set a chronometer by it. First, the nutrient spill in the canteen from the Glimmer folk, whose idea of breakfast involves a lot of shimmering edible dust. Then the gelatinous puddles left by the aquatic delegates near the hydration chambers. By midday, he's polishing the handrails in the command wing, where important people in crisp uniforms talk about things like trade routes and ceasefires without ever appearing to notice the man wiping their fingerprints away. And he doesn't mind, really. Psychology studies sometimes talk about institutional invisibility, how, in highly structured environments, service staff can become part of the cognitive scenery, noticed only when something is out of place. For Marcus, that's not a bug. It's the point. Between swipes of the mop, he has conversations with his equipment. "All right, Steve," he'll mutter to the mop handle. "Looks like the Threllians had another heated discussion in conference room 4. Bioplasmic residue. They really need to work on keeping their emotions in check." It's a dry, running commentary that keeps the silence and the memories at a comfortable distance. After 12 years of active service, a lot of veterans seek out jobs with structure, clear tasks, and low stakes. No life or death decisions, no command structure, no one shooting at you. Just a checklist, a mop bucket, and the satisfying swipe of a clean floor. For Marcus, janitorial work was the perfect cover, a way to disappear on purpose. So when a new ship decloaks at the edge of Harmony Station's docking array, shiny and sleek and radiating superiority, Marcus just notes the new scuff marks it'll probably leave on the deck plating. He doesn't look up. He just keeps mopping, the story of a life told in polished metal. Commander Vex was handed the open container, expecting perhaps keepsakes or sentimental junk. What he got was a timeline of violence, precision, and honor that didn't fit inside the tiny, sterile room of a maintenance worker. Laid out in precise rows on dark velvet were medals, each one a contradiction. They weren't trinkets. They were a resume. The first one that caught the light was a silver starburst with crossed blades behind it. The Valor Crest, awarded for actions under direct enemy fire. Next to it lay a dark circle edged in crimson, the mark of Meridian, given to those who held defensive lines against overwhelming odds. And tucked beside that a simple, severe bar of blackened titanium, the Silent Service Medal, for operations that never officially happened. In human military tradition, these aren't participation trophies. They're shorthand for sacrifice, for moments where the difference between life and death came down to one person's decision to stand when everything said run. Across cultures, military honors serve as condensed narratives. They tell a story without words. To a Zephyrian like Vex, whose own society assigned roles at birth and kept them rigid, the idea that a janitor could also be a decorated soldier created a kind of cognitive short circuit. He stood there holding the box, his feathers subtly shifting in tone, a physiological tell for confusion among his kind. His mind, trained to categorize and control, was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and the peg was winning. You could see the recalculations happening behind his eyes. The man who mopped floors also held a medal for distinguished command. The person who quietly cleaned up after diplomats had once led assaults in the atmospheric storms of Titan. Each ribbon, each etched piece of metal, chipped away at Vex's certainty. This wasn't a servant. This was an archive of sanctioned violence, worn not on the sleeve, but under the bed. Cognitive dissonance is that mental discomfort you feel when faced with information that clashes with what you thought you knew. For Vex, every metal in that box was a data point that shattered his worldview. Humans weren't docile, they were dormant. And that distinction carried implications his security briefing had never covered. He looked from the open container to the sparse room, the neatly folded uniform, the well-maintained cleaning cart, the humble cot. None of it made sense anymore. The arithmetic of superiority he'd been using suddenly had new variables, dangerous ones. 17, that was the final count. 17 separate acknowledgments of excellence, courage, or outright lethality, all belonging to one unassuming man in coveralls. Vex closed the lid, the soft click sounding unusually loud in the quiet room. His expression was no longer one of arrogant dismissal. It was sharp, focused, and deeply unsettled. He turned to the nearest guard, his voice low but clear. "Bring the janitor now, I want to speak with him." Not as a subordinate, not as staff, but as someone with answers to a question the Zephyrians had never thought to ask. Who are you people, really? So they bring the janitor in to explain his own life. Marcus enters the conference room still wearing his maintenance coveralls, a faint smell of cleaning solvent trailing him. 2 Zephyrian guards flank him, but they seem more like escorts than captors now. Commander Vex stands rigid beside the open box of medals, his feathers shifting through muted shades of gray and blue, the Zephyrian equivalent of a furrowed brow. Marcus doesn't look nervous. He looks patient, like a teacher waiting for a slow student to catch up. Vex points to the open container. "Explain this." His voice is flat, but there's a new tension in it, the kind that comes when your worldview is cracking. Marcus glances at the medals. He doesn't smile, doesn't frown. His expression is neutral, almost detached. Combat veterans often develop this kind of calm. After enough firefights, enough loss, adrenaline stops ruling you. You learn to state facts without emotion. It's not stoicism. It's efficiency. That one, Marcus says, pointing to a silver starburst. Titan campaign. Atmospheric insertion. Lost 3 dropships to electrical storms before we made landfall. He moves his finger. The dark one with the red edge. Martian uprisings. Held the volleys Marineris Narrows for 6 days with half a company. They threw conscripts at us like confetti. We ran out of ammo on the 4th day. Used their own weapons after that. His tone is matter of fact. He might as well be listing grocery items. He continues, cataloging conflicts the Zephyrians had no record of. The piracy suppression campaigns along the Jupiter trade routes. The border skirmishes in the Kuiper Belt that never made the news feeds. Each medal represents a chapter in a hidden history of violence and resolve. These weren't small operations. The Titan Wars involved entire fleets, thousands of personnel, and orbital bombardments that reshaped moonscapes. The Martian conflict saw urban combat across 3 domed cities, with civilian evacuations under fire. The scale is staggering. And Marcus describes it all with the same dry clarity you'd use to explain a plumbing repair. No pride, no regret, just facts. He's not trying to impress them. He's just answering the question. For Vex, each named campaign is a data point that rewrites his understanding of human capability. These weren't police actions. They were full-scale wars fought in environments that would kill most species in minutes. And this man, this janitor, had not only survived them, he'd excelled. The room is silent when he finishes. The Zephyrians are no longer looking at a maintenance worker. They're looking at a historical artifact that suddenly started talking. Vex's earlier arrogance is gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. He thought he was dealing with a simple species that followed orders. Now he's staring at a people who have been quietly perfecting the art of war in places his own military would avoid. And that realization leads to a much bigger, much more dangerous question. This was the concept the Galactics could never grasp. Commander Vex stared at Marcus, his feathers shifting through confused shades of gray. He was trying to fit the man into a familiar category. A warrior who'd abandoned his station, a soldier who'd fallen from grace. In most advanced species, military service is a permanent caste. You're born into it, or you're selected young and you stay until you die. The idea of stepping away is unthinkable. It's like resigning from your own biology. But Marcus just shook his head, a faint, dry amusement in his eyes. We don't have a warrior caste, he said. His voice was calm, factual. We have citizens. Sometimes they serve. Then they go home. The framework Vex was using didn't just fail to fit. It didn't even exist here. Humanity's approach is less about creating a separate class of fighters and more about temporary, intensive investment in ordinary people. You take teachers, mechanics, artists, anyone who volunteers, and you train them. You drill them until their responses are automatic, until tactics live in their muscles alongside the memory of how to swing a hammer or write code. Then when their service is done, they return to their lives. They become teachers, mechanics, artists again. But they don't unlearn what they were taught. The training never really leaves you. It rewires you. Muscle memory is a powerful thing. The way you clear a room, the way you assess a threat, the way you fall asleep anywhere in seconds. These aren't just skills. They become part of your nervous system. Even trauma, the psychological weight of what you've seen and done, becomes a kind of dark fuel. It sits there dormant under the surface of everyday life. You might be fixing an engine or mopping a floor, but part of you is always quietly counting exits, always measuring distances, always ready. It's a system built on a terrifying premise, that the potential for extreme violence and extreme discipline exists in almost everyone. That you don't need a special breed. You just need good training and a reason to fight. For the Zephyrians, whose society is built on rigid, inherited roles, this is a chaotic, almost horrifying idea. It means you can't identify a threat by its uniform or its status. The most dangerous human in the room might be the one serving your drinks. Vex was completely still now, processing. His entire understanding of power and hierarchy was being dismantled piece by piece. He came from a culture where you knew your place and everyone else's. Humanity's model was the opposite. It was fluid. It was hidden. It meant that their strength wasn't concentrated in an army you could see and count. It was distributed throughout their entire population, waiting. Marcus watched him, his expression still neutral. He'd delivered the basic truth. But he hadn't yet delivered the conclusion. The real shock wasn't that humanity could create soldiers. It was what that meant for their entire species. The quiet man in the coveralls was about to make that utterly, terrifyingly clear. The explanation was over. The declaration was next. The quietest sentence with the loudest echo. Marcus looked at Commander Vex, his expression not angry, not defiant, just certain, like a man stating a simple mathematical truth, the kind you don't argue with. Vex was still wrestling with the idea of a society without a warrior class, trying to fit the concept into his rigid understanding of order. His feathers had settled into a muted, confused gray. He opened his mouth, probably to ask another question, to try and categorize this anomaly. Marcus spoke first. His voice was calm, level, almost gentle. You keep trying to put me in a box, Commander. There is no box. The truth is simpler. He paused, letting the silence hang for a second. We don't have a warrior caste. Another beat. We are the warrior caste, that was it. No grand pronouncement, no boast. Just 5 words, delivered with the flat certainty of a man describing the color of the sky. In strategic communication, the most powerful statements are often the simplest. They don't try to convince. They just are. They reframe reality in a handful of syllables. forcing the listener to either accept a new truth or be left behind. This wasn't a claim of superiority. It was a statement of fact. Humanity's strength wasn't a subset of its population. It was its baseline. The effect on Vex was immediate and total. His feathers didn't just shift color. They seemed to freeze, locked in a stark ashen hue. His posture, usually so perfectly controlled, went rigid. You could almost see the calculations exploding behind his eyes. It wasn't just about one janitor with a hidden past. It was about the implications. If this man, this unassuming maintenance worker, was a sample of the whole, then every human on the station was a potential variable. The chef, the engineer, the botanist, and the hydroponics bay, none of them were civilians in the Zephyrian sense of the word. They were all reservists, dormant soldiers. The strategic advantage of hidden strength is immense. Sun Tzu wrote about it millennia ago. The pinnacle of military excellence is not to win every battle, but to win without fighting. To present such an undeniable, if concealed, capacity for force, that conflict becomes unthinkable. Humanity hadn't been hiding its military. It had been living its military, dispersed throughout its entire society, camouflaged by ordinary lives. The element of surprise wasn't tactical. It was existential. The Zephyrians hadn't miscalculated the size of an army. They had failed to identify the army at all. It was standing next to them in the mess hall. It was fixing their comms array. It was mopping the floor. Vex's mission, his entire understanding of this diplomatic engagement, collapsed in that moment. He hadn't been negotiating from a position of strength. He'd been issuing commands to a hornet's nest while believing it was a log. His empire's strategy, built on intimidation and perceived superiority, was now based on a critical flaw in their intelligence. They thought they were dealing with servants. They were dealing with sentinels. The quiet in the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the sound of a paradigm shattering. Marcus watched Vex process it all, his own face still neutral. He'd delivered the core truth, the secret humanity never led with. Now came the consequences. Because panic, especially the panic of a powerful entity suddenly realizing its vulnerability, makes you do stupid, desperate things. And Vex was nothing if not powerful. And he was looking very, very vulnerable. The next move would be his. And it would be a mistake. Panic makes you do stupid things. Ambassador Claxon saw his carefully constructed reality dissolving, and his first instinct was to reassert control. The quiet, menacing certainty in Marcus's voice, the dawning horror on Vex's face, it was all collapsing too fast. Claxon's feathers flushed a deep, agitated purple. He couldn't process the strategic implications. He could only react. "This man is clearly a security risk," he announced, his voice losing its smooth resonance, sharpening into a command. "Detain him now." His guards moved. Two of them stepped toward Marcus, their movements still precise, trained. One reached for his arm. The tension in the room spiked. A sudden, violent shift in atmosphere. It was a classic escalation. When authority feels its narrative crumbling, it often defaults to the simplest tool: force. The immediate physical act of seizing someone is meant to re-establish the hierarchy, to remind everyone who gives the orders and who follows them. For a second, it seemed like it would work. The story would end the way these stories always end for those who challenge power. Predictably, quietly. But the reaction didn't come from Marcus. He didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He just stood there calm, watching. The reaction came from the periphery, from the human staff who had been observing everything, their faces tight, their bodies still. The young comms officer Claxon had brushed aside earlier. The technician whose family photo had been dismissed. The quiet environmental engineer who'd been running system diagnostics in the corner. Social psychology has a term for this: emergent norm theory. In a crisis, when a shared threat becomes clear, group behavior can crystallize in an instant. Shared outrage overrides individual caution. A new norm forms, and it's one of solidarity. You don't need a speech. You just need one person to make the first move. The first to step forward was the chef from the station's galley, a large man still wearing his stained apron. He didn't say a word. He just moved between the Zephyrian guard and Marcus, crossing his arms. His expression was flat, his posture solid. The second was the female technician, her hands now clenched at her sides, her earlier humiliation replaced by a cold, focused anger. She stepped up beside the chef, then the comms officer, then the mechanic. One by one, without a signal, Without a spoken plan, they moved. They didn't form a line. They formed a wall. It wasn't an aggressive stance. It was a blocking stance, a simple physical refusal. The Zephyrian guard's hand stopped inches from Marcus's arm, hesitating. He looked from the wall of humans to Commander Vex, his training faltering in the face of this unexpected silent cohesion. The calculation had changed completely. This wasn't about arresting one man anymore. It was about confronting a united front they never knew was there. Ambassador Claxon stared, his feathers now a stunned mottled gray. His attempt to regain control had achieved the exact opposite. It had revealed it, not in Marcus, but in everyone else. They weren't just colleagues watching a coworker get arrested. They were a unit responding to a threat. And as more station staff subtly shifted their weight, as more eyes locked onto the Zephyrians from across the room, it became terrifyingly clear that this network was far larger and far more coordinated than anyone had imagined. The arrest had failed. The unveiling had just begun. They weren't just colleagues. They were a battalion. The silence stretched heavy and electric after the station staff moved to block Marcus's arrest. Then one by one they started speaking. Not shouts, not challenges, simple calm identifications. Sergeant Eva Rostova, Martian Mobile Infantry 3rd Division. The chef's voice was low, his arms still crossed over his apron. Specialist Ben Carter, Orbital Drop Shock Troopers. The mechanic wiping grease from his hands onto his pants. Lieutenant Anya Sharma, Fleet Intelligence. The comms officer, her chin raised. Each statement was a nail in the coffin of the Zephyrians' assumption. They were all veterans. The dawning horror on the aliens' faces was a physical thing. Ambassador Claxon's feathers had lost all their iridescent shimmer, settling into a dull, ashen gray. Commander Vex's hand, which had been raised to signal his guards, slowly lowered. This wasn't a protest. It was a reveal. They had been so focused on the one anomaly, the janitor with the box of medals, that they'd completely missed the pattern. In human society, veterans don't just disappear into dedicated military colonies. They reintegrate. They become your neighbors, your mechanics, your chefs. They take jobs that value discipline, structure, and knowing how to keep a cool head. Jobs exactly like running the critical systems of a deep space station. The Zephyrians had based their entire strategy on a critical misreading of human demography. Then came the math. It was simple and devastating. If this many veterans were on one station, how many were in the sector? On a transport ship? On a mining colony? The number wasn't just large. It was galactic scale. The Zephyrians had been trying to intimidate a species that had effectively militarized its entire adult population, then put them back in civilian clothes. This is the other thing about military service they didn't understand. The bonds formed there aren't employment contracts. They're deeper. A band of brothers mentality isn't a poetic phrase. It's a psychological reality, a loyalty that bypasses logic and hierarchy. You don't turn that off when you take off the uniform. It sleeps. And right now on Harmony Station, it was very much awake. The strategic advantage this network held was now terrifyingly clear. They weren't a random group of disgruntled workers. They were a coordinated, trained, and experienced force, embedded in the very infrastructure the Zephyrians relied on. They knew the station's layout better than anyone. They knew its weaknesses, its pressure points, and they were all looking at the Zephyrian delegation with the same calm, assessing gaze Marcus had. The power in the room had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer about who had the title of ambassador or commander. So when the final count was silently acknowledged, the number hung in the air, more powerful than any weapon. Out of a human staff of just over 200 on Harmony Station, more than 60 identified themselves. 60 soldiers, hiding in plain sight, waiting. The question was no longer who they were. The question was what they controlled. And the answer to that was about to redefine the meaning of command on Harmony Station. It's not the people with the fancy titles. The Zephyrians assumed command rested with the diplomats in pressed suits, the security chiefs with their shiny badges. But the veterans just looked at them calm, almost pitying. Command is an illusion, a title on a door. Real power, the kind that keeps a 500,000-ton station alive in the vacuum, lives in the systems. And they run the systems. The list is short, devastating, life support. The oxygen mixers, the carbon dioxide scrubbers, the temperature regulators that keep the station from freezing or boiling, gravity plating, Not just the general field, but the local controls in every corridor, every room. Communications, every channel, internal and external. And the docking clamps. The massive magnetic locks that hold every ship, including the Zephyrian sleek needle of a vessel securely in place. In any complex technological environment, the most vulnerable points aren't the obvious weapons. They're the life-giving, structure-holding essentials, the things you only notice when they stop working. Think of it like a building. The owner sits in the penthouse believing he's in charge. But the janitor has the master key. He controls the electricity, the water, the elevators, the air conditioning. He can lock every door. This is soft power in its most literal physical form. It's not about having a bigger army. It's about controlling the environment the army stands in. The veteran staff of Harmony Station didn't need to aim a weapon. They just needed to know which switch to flip. The demonstration was subtle. No alarms blared. No lights flickered. But the gravity in the conference room shifted. Just for a second. Not enough to make anyone stumble. Just enough to feel it. A sudden, heavy pull toward the deck, then a return to normal. It was a nudge. A reminder. The environmental engineer, the one who'd identified herself as a veteran, hadn't moved. She just tilted her head slightly. The message was clear. This isn't a theory. We aren't bluffing. We are stating a fact. You are guests in a house whose plumbing, wiring, and foundations we maintain. Your comfort, your communication, your ability to leave is a function of our continued cooperation. The Zephyrians felt it. The change in gravity was a physical confirmation of the new reality. Their arrogance, their sense of inherent superiority, was based on a fundamental error. They thought they were negotiating from a position of strength. They were negotiating from a position of utter dependence. The critical station systems weren't just operated by humans. They were controlled by a network of trained, coordinated veterans who had just revealed they were willing to use that control. So when the gravity settled back to its familiar pull, all eyes turned to Marcus. He was still standing where he'd been, quiet in his coveralls. But he wasn't the janitor anymore. The posture was different. The set of his shoulders, the calm assessment in his eyes. The man with the mop was gone. In his place stood the commander. And he was about to start talking terms. The man with the mop is now the man in charge. Marcus's posture shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change. He didn't puff out his chest or raise his voice. It was subtler. The slump left his shoulders. The quiet deference evaporated from his eyes. He stood like someone who was used to having his words listened to. His voice when he spoke was calm, level. It carried without needing volume. He looked at Ambassador Claxon, then at Commander Vex. "You have a choice," he said. No greeting, no preamble, just a statement. You can order your ship to depart, or you can experience a station-wide systems failure. He listed the possibilities, his tone matter-of-fact, like a mechanic explaining a repair. The gravity plating could selectively disengage, turning sections of the station into zero-G obstacle courses. The oxygen scrubbers in the Zephyrian sectors could cycle offline for precisely 10 minutes, not long enough to cause permanent harm, but long enough to make breathing a frantic, panicked effort. The docking clamps on their ship could develop a sudden, inexplicable resonance frequency, shaking the vessel apart at the molecular level without a single shot being fired. These weren't threats of violence. They were promises of profound inconvenience, delivered with the certainty of a man who knew exactly which buttons to push. This is the art of the ultimatum from a position of absolute strength. You don't scream. You don't bluster. You simply outline the new reality and the consequences of ignoring it. The most effective threats are credible, specific, and non-negotiable. They leave no room for interpretation. Marcus wasn't asking. He was informing. The Zephyrians had come to bully a servant race and had instead stumbled into a hornet's nest. Their entire calculation of risk was now upside down. The potential loss wasn't just face. It was their ship, their comfort, their very ability to breathe. You could see them processing it. Claxon's feathers were utterly still, a flat, defeated gray. Vex's professional demeanor was cracking, his eyes darting around the room as if he could see the systems Marcus described, feel their vulnerability. They were weighing the odds. Was it a bluff? But the gravity had already flickered. The humans in the room were watching, silent and united. The threat wasn't coming from one man. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air. The cost of calling that bluff was unacceptably high. They had no way to counter it. Their arrogance, their sense of innate superiority, had blinded them to the actual power structure of the station. They weren't in command. They were guests, and their welcome had just been formally revoked. The silence that followed was the sound of a paradigm collapsing. Marcus waited, his expression neutral. He had delivered the terms. The next move was theirs. But it wasn't really a move at all. It was a surrender. The Zephyrians had no cards left to play. The ultimatum had worked. The only question now was how gracefully they would accept their defeat, and what kind of galactic relationship would be built from its ashes. The negotiation was over. The reset was about to begin. It was the perfect description of the human condition. The tension in the room hadn't broken so much as it had transformed. The ultimatum hung in the air, accepted by the Zephyrians' silence. But Marcus, watching the dawning realization on their faces, offered one last piece of context. Not a threat, an explanation. His voice was dry, almost amused. You know, he said, we have a saying back on Earth about predators pretending to be house pets. He let the words settle. Took me a while to get the reference. Now I think I see it. This single wry metaphor reframed everything. Every interaction the Zephyrians had ever had with humanity was suddenly cast in a new, terrifying light. The helpful technicians, the efficient cooks, the quiet cleaning staff, it hadn't been docility. It had been a performance, a carefully maintained disguise of harmlessness that the entire species seemed to wear by default. The galaxy, from the Zephyrian perspective, was now filled with beings who looked like servants but were, in their core, something else entirely, something with teeth they kept politely hidden. Strategic studies often use animal behavior as a shorthand for diplomatic posturing. A nation might act like a lion to project strength, or a fox to convey cunning. But humanity's analogy was different. It was the wolf that lounges by the fireplace, the bear that tends the garden. The power isn't in the display, it's in the concealment. The advantage goes to the player whose true capabilities remain unknown until the moment they choose to reveal them. The Zephyrians had based their entire approach on a catastrophic misclassification. They thought they were managing livestock. They suddenly understood they were sharing a very small, very fragile station with a pack of wolves. The terror on their faces was no longer about a lost negotiation. It was a primal, species-level fear of the unknown. The shock of discovering a hidden nature in something you believed was simple and predictable is one of the most deeply unsettling psychological experiences. It makes you question your own perception, your own safety, your entire understanding of the world. Ambassador Claxon looked at the human staff around him not as subordinates but as locked boxes, and he had no idea what was inside anymore. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. He had been issuing commands to creatures whose true potential he could not even measure. All of this meant the old rules were void. The terms of engagement couldn't be written around trade quotas or docking fees anymore. They had to be built on a new fundamental acknowledgement. Humanity was not a servant race. They were a sleeping giant, and the Zephyrians had just tapped it on the shoulder. The new agreement would have to be one of mutual respect, or it would be nothing at all. The power dynamic had been permanently inverted. As the Zephyrians processed this, Marcus glanced down at his coveralls, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. Might have to update my resume after this, he muttered, almost to himself. Add interspecies conflict resolution to the skills section. Probably looks better than floor waxing. The joke was dark, dry, and landed with perfect weight. It was the veteran's way of understating the monumental shift he had just engineered. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He was noting a change in his job description. From anonymous maintenance to galactic strategist, all in a day's work. The immediate crisis was over, but the real work was just beginning. The station still had to function. The Zephyrians still had to leave. And a new galactic order, one based on a terrifying and newfound respect, needed to be drafted. The silence in the room was now filled with the quiet hum of computers and the unspoken understanding that nothing would ever be the same. Everything changed in about 10 minutes. Director Hayes sat back down at the conference table. The datapad in front of him was the same. The room was the same, but the context had completely shifted. He wasn't negotiating from a position of hoped-for compromise anymore. He was speaking from a foundation of unspoken, undeniable strength. His voice was calm, but it carried a new weight. The conversation wasn't about trade concessions or docking fees now. It was about mutual respect. It was about a formal, unequivocal recognition of human sovereignty. The language of the new agreement was specific, careful. It included clauses that explicitly prohibited the classification of any human citizen as belonging to a servant or subordinate class in any Zephyrian database, treaty, or official communication. It guaranteed the inviolability of personal quarters and human-controlled spaces on any shared facility. Post-conflict negotiation theory calls this norm setting. You don't just stop the bleeding. You build a new set of rules to prevent the next wound. The goal is to establish boundaries so clear that violating them becomes unthinkable. Hayes's tone was polite, but the subtext was ironclad. Humanity would be treated as an equal, or there would be no relationship at all. Commander Vex watched this happen. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a sharp professional assessment. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a soldier. And soldiers understand force, not just the blunt kind, but the strategic, clever, deeply embedded kind that the humans had just revealed. There's a certain respect that exists between military professionals, even adversaries, when true capability is demonstrated. It bypasses politics and pride. Vex looked at Marcus, at the other veterans standing quietly around the room, and he saw not servants but a formidable, organized force. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't friendship. It was acknowledgement. He respected the source of the power that had just checkmated him. The game had changed, and he was a good enough strategist to recognize a superior play. The anticipation now was for a signal, something beyond words on a datapad, a physical sign that the message had been received and understood, not just on this station, but across the Zephyrian expansion. That the new diplomatic norms weren't just local, they were galactic. The agreement was signed with digital fingerprints, a quiet series of beeps confirming the transfer. The room was silent for a moment, the formality of it hanging in the air. Then Director Hayes stood. "I believe your ship is prepared for departure," he said, his tone neutral. It wasn't a question. The entire dynamic between the species had been rewritten. The discovery of Marcus's metals and the network of veterans behind him hadn't just saved a negotiation. It had redefined humanity's place in the galactic community. They were no longer the newcomers hoping for a seat at the table. They were the players who controlled the room the table was in. The Zephyrians had learned a costly, humbling lesson about underestimating a species that prefers to keep its teeth hidden. As the Zephyrian delegation filed out, their postures less rigid, their feathers muted, Director Hayes walked to the large viewport that looked out onto the star-dusted blackness of space. The conversation was over. The reset was complete. But the real confirmation of their success wouldn't come from a signed document. It would come from what happened next out there in the quiet, infinite dark. The cavalry wasn't coming. It was already there. As the Zephyrian delegation prepared for their subdued departure, the first ship appeared on the long-range scanners. Not a warship, not a sleek dagger of military might, a bulky, squared-off civilian transport vessel, the kind that hauls machinery and personnel between outposts. Then another blip appeared, and another, a small flotilla of unarmed, utterly ordinary human ships, dropping out of warp at the very edge of the system. They didn't approach. They didn't issue threats. They just hung there in the black, their navigation lights blinking in the silent pattern of vessels holding position. For the Zephyrians watching from their viewports, the message was chillingly clear. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a demonstration, a quiet, unmissable reminder of humanity's logistical reach. Military strategy has long understood the power of presence. You don't always need to deploy your fleet. Sometimes just having it known that you can deploy it, that your assets are mobile and nearby, is enough to shift the entire balance of a negotiation. These weren't fighter craft, but their sudden, coordinated appearance spoke of a network that could mobilize on a moment's notice. They were outnumbered not by soldiers, but by the sheer, undeniable fact of human connectivity. The Zephyrians had thought they were dealing with a single station. They were now facing a system. Among the human staff on Harmony, the effect was different. A quiet sigh of relief moved through the corridors. Shoulders that had been tense for hours finally relaxed. It wasn't a cheer or a celebration. It was the deep psychological comfort of knowing you are not alone. Studies on group dynamics show that perceived support, even from a distance, dramatically increases a group's resilience and resolve. The sight of those ships was a visual confirmation that the station wasn't an isolated outpost. It was a node in a vast, responsive web. The veterans exchanged quiet nods. This was the backup they knew existed but hadn't called for. Its arrival now was a perfect silent statement of solidarity. The Zephyrians understood the arithmetic immediately. Their ship was alone. Those transports, harmless as they looked, represented a fraction of the human presence in the sector. To engage in any further conflict would be to invite a response from a force whose full size and scope they could only guess at. The element of surprise was gone. The advantage of intimidation was lost. Their departure was no longer just a diplomatic formality. It was a strategic necessity. As their sleek vessel began its launch sequence, detaching from the station with a quiet finality, the atmosphere on Harmony shifted toward a new normalcy. It wasn't the same as before. The illusion of human docility had been permanently shattered. The station would return to its routines, but every interaction now happened under a new understanding. The janitor polishing the handrails, the chef in the galley, the tech running diagnostics, they were all part of something larger, something watchful. Marcus stood near a viewport watching the Zephyrian ship shrink into a distant star. He didn't smile. He just shook his head slightly, a dry comment escaping under his breath. Definitely updating the resume after this. Interspecies conflict resolution sounds better than stain removal specialist. Maybe even put diplomatic liaison. The joke was typical veteran humor, using understatement to process the absurdity of a situation where a floor mopper just redrew the galactic power map. His coveralls were still stained. The mop bucket was waiting. But the galaxy and his place in it had fundamentally changed. The galaxy shifted on its axis, and then it was time to clean the floors. Marcus Rodriguez was back in his coveralls, pushing his squeaking cart down corridor B12. The Zephyrian ship was a distant speck against the starfield. The diplomats had returned to their carefully worded memos, and the air scrubbers hummed their familiar, monotonous tune. The crisis was over. The station was quiet, but the knowledge hung in the recycled air, a permanent change in atmospheric pressure. Everyone saw him differently now. The junior tech who gave him a quick, awkward nod of respect. The Glimmerfolk ambassador who actually met his eyes for a half-second instead of staring through him. And Marcus himself felt it. The janitor's uniform didn't feel like a disguise anymore. It felt like a choice. He muttered to his mop Steve, his voice a low, dry rumble. Note to self, update the resume. 12 years exemplary sanitary maintenance. Add recent experience in interstellar diplomatic recalibration and strategic power realignment, probably. Looks better than proficient with industrial cleaning. Solvents. It was the kind of dark, understated humor that veterans use to sand down the sharp edges of absurdity. Psychologists call this cognitive reintegration, the process of returning to a mundane routine after a high-stakes traumatic event. The mind tries to fit the extraordinary into the framework of the ordinary, often through irony and understatement. You don't talk about the fear or the adrenaline. You joke about your LinkedIn profile. The new respect he received was subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't in grand gestures. It was in the way a cluster of junior diplomats parted to let him and his cart pass without a hint of annoyance. It was in the station director's slight, almost imperceptible incline of the head when their paths crossed near the command center. Social dynamics research shows that displays of competence, especially courage under pressure, can instantly rewrite an individual's status within a group, regardless of their formal role. The man they had treated as furniture had proven to be the load-bearing wall. That kind of thing tends to change the conversation. He finished mopping a section of deck plating near the viewport, the surface gleaming under the sterile lights. He looked at his reflection in the clean, wet floor, a man in a simple uniform, a tool in his hand. The philosophical point was so obvious he almost laughed. The skills weren't opposites. Discipline was discipline. Attention to detail was attention to detail. Whether you were clearing a room of hostiles or a floor of alien bioresidue, the mindset was the same. The galaxy thought it had learned a lesson about hidden warriors. Marcus knew the deeper truth was about transferable skills. The universe was just a very large, very complicated station, and someone always had to clean it up. His joke about the resume wasn't about getting a better job. It was about recognizing that his current one had just expanded in scope, significantly, He patted the mop handle. Come on, Steve, galley's probably a mess. The breakfast shift always is. And with that, he pushed the cart forward, the squeak of its wheels a familiar sound in the newly quiet corridor, the man and his mop returning to the work that, in its own way, kept the galaxy turning. The punchline that contained the whole truth. Marcus finished mopping a section of the corridor floor near the mess hall, stepping back to eye his work with the same critical precision he once used to survey a battlefield. The wet surface gleamed under the harsh station lights, a perfect, unbroken sheet of clean. The tension in the narration isn't about conflict anymore. It's about synthesis. The warrior and the janitor weren't two separate people living in one skin. They were the same set of skills applied to different problems. Discipline, observation, the understanding that sometimes the most powerful move is to care deeply about a job nobody else notices. He leaned on the mop handle, a dry, almost invisible smile touching his lips. Good customer service, he muttered to the empty hallway, is about meeting the client's needs. Sometimes that's a sparkling floor, sometimes. He let the sentence hang, the mop handle feeling familiar and solid in his grip. It's a persuasive argument, and this thing has a decent reach. The line landed perfectly, a blend of dark humor and profound truth. Research into skill transferability shows that competencies like situational awareness, systematic problem solving, and calm under pressure aren't job-specific. They're cognitive tools. A soldier clearing a hostile room and a janitor clearing a dirty one are both assessing terrain, identifying problems, and executing a solution. The tool might be a rifle or a mop, but the mindset is frighteningly similar. Our perception is the limiting factor, not the capability. Because of that, the galaxy is now a slightly safer, slightly more respectful place. Not because a fleet won a battle, but because a janitor did his job with such unassuming excellence that it forced an entire arrogant empire to recalibrate its worldview. Sociology often studies the butterfly effect of individual actions, how one person's decisions can ripple through complex systems, altering trajectories in ways that are impossible to predict. Marcus Rodriguez didn't set out to change interstellar politics. He set out to clean a floor. But by being exceptional at both his visible and hidden roles, he demonstrated a strength that reshaped the diplomatic landscape. The impact wasn't in a grand speech or a show of force. It was in a box of medals under a bed and a willingness to use a mop for more than its intended purpose. The story's end is its own payoff. There's no need for a dramatic climax because the point has been made. The quiet satisfaction comes from seeing the circle complete. The man, the mop, the clean floor. The galaxy hums on, but the hum has a new, more respectful frequency to it. It's a conclusion that ties the theme together without bowing on it. Strength and humility aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. And sometimes that coin is spent on a job well done, regardless of who's watching. So the next time you see someone doing a job everyone overlooks, remember the story of Marcus Rodriguez. Remember that strength often wears the disguise of humility, and that the most dangerous people are the ones you never see coming. What hidden strength is lying dormant in your own world, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? So the next time you see someone doing a thankless job, remember Marcus Rodriguez mopping floors on Harmony Station. Remember that real strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears coveralls. Sometimes it's quiet. The most capable people are often the ones you overlook, carrying entire histories in silence. What looks like humility might just be patience. What seems ordinary might be anything but. Look around. What unseen potential is waiting in your world? Hidden behind a uniform, a job title, a quiet demeanor. The most surprising strength is often the one you never see coming.